He banged on my door and said I had two options: hand over my lake cabin or deal with his powerful mother. I almost laughed until the cops showed up. She didn't know I am the law around here. If you love stories where the quiet one turns out to have the final say, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. It was just after 6 when the knock came. The lake was still, shadows long on the water, and I'd just poured a cup of coffee from the percolator that sat humming on the stovetop. Out here, the mornings don't rush you. No sirens, no traffic, no radio chatter. Just the creak of pine trees, the slow drift of fog on the lake, and the breath of your own peace. That's why I come here, to the old family cabin, passed down from my grandfather, who built it with his hands after coming back from the war. I figured it was a delivery, or maybe one of the neighbors needing help with something. I wasn't in uniform, just jeans and a thermal shirt, barefoot on the cool wood floor. When I opened the door, I expected a familiar face. Instead, I found a teenager with too much confidence and not enough sense standing on my porch like he owned the place. He had the kind of swagger you only earn from getting away with too much. Hair slicked back, mirrored sunglasses pushed up on his head, hoodie zipped halfway, and some kind of smug smile stretching across his face, like he was about to offer me a deal I couldn't refuse. "You're gonna need to pack up your stuff," he said, nodding toward the cabin behind me. "This place belongs to us now. My mom says it was supposed to be in our family years ago, and we're reclaiming it." I didn't say anything right away. I just looked at him, let the silence hang a little too long. You can tell a lot about a person by how they handle silence. This one squirmed. "You deaf or something?" he added, shifting his weight. "I'm just giving you a heads up before we call somebody. You're trespassing." He couldn't have been more than 18, but he stood there like he'd already won. Like I'd nod, say sorry, and start folding up my fishing gear and photos and memories, and walk off like this was a tent and not the only piece of land that still connected me to my family. I leaned one shoulder against the doorframe and took a sip of my coffee. "You live around here?" I asked him. "My mum's on the HOA. We own the lakefront over on the east bank, and this cabin's part of the disputed boundary. She says this lot was misregistered and should have gone to her father. She's coming by later with paperwork." "Your mum have a name?" He tilted his chin up like it was supposed to mean something. "Deborah Renshaw. People call her Deb. She runs the homeowners board." I smiled, mostly to myself, then finished the rest of my coffee. The name was familiar. Deb Renshaw was the sort of woman who wrote letters to the mayor every other week, demanded leash laws and boat curfews, and banned campfires after dusk. I'd seen her kind before, from the city to the county, always demanding something, always convinced they were the victim of someone else's mistake. "You can stay for now," he continued, "but once we get the cops involved, you'll be forced to leave. You might as well start packing." I stepped out onto the porch, barefoot on the planks my grandfather laid with his own 2 hands, and looked out across the lake. The water caught the sky like a mirror, unbothered by the sound of this boy's voice or the rising bravado in it. A loon cried in the distance. I watched it fly low over the water, then turned back to him. "You sure that's the route you want to take?" He narrowed his eyes. "What, you gonna threaten me?" "No. Just wondering if you've thought it all the way through." He shifted again, the arrogance flinching ever so slightly. Then he pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over the screen. "I'll give you till this afternoon. My mum's bringing the paperwork and we're calling the cops. You'll be gone by sundown, one way or another." I nodded slowly, not out of agreement, just acknowledgement. "Appreciate the warning," I said. He smirked, turned on his heel, and stomped back to his lifted truck. Mud tires, custom plates, something loud and unnecessary rattling under the hood. He didn't look back as he drove off, probably imagining me inside, panicked, throwing things into a duffel. I stood on the porch for a long time after he left. The morning had cooled, and the breeze off the lake carried the first hint of autumn. Inside, the coffee had gone lukewarm, but I didn't move. I was still thinking about his last words. "You'll be gone by sundown, one way or another." Poor kid had no idea who he was talking to, and he sure didn't know what was going to happen when his mother showed up with those papers. Because when the cops came, they'd be reporting to me. The sound of tires crunching gravel broke the midday stillness. I had just come in from chopping a bit of firewood, arms dusted with bark and sweat drying on my shirt, when I heard the unmistakable purr of a luxury SUV. I stepped out onto the porch, wiping my hands on a rag, and watched a silver Lexus ease into the clearing like it didn't quite belong here. The kind of vehicle more at home in country clubs than cabins. Its windows were tinted, but I could already picture the woman behind the wheel. The driver's door opened and out stepped Deborah Renshaw, exactly as I remembered from the town council meetings she used to crash like clockwork. Stiff posture, layered blonde hair that had clearly seen more salons than wind, sunglasses perched in her hair like a crown. She wore a crisp white blouse tucked into beige slacks, heels too sharp for forest ground, and a look that told the world she never questioned herself. A clipboard was clutched in one manicured hand like it gave her authority. Behind her came the boy, walking like he'd brought a judge in his pocket. "Good afternoon," she called out, voice bright but strained, the way someone speaks when they think they're being polite to someone beneath them. She glanced around, barely hiding the disdain in her eyes as they skimmed over the porch, the cabin's logs, the wind chime over the door. I didn't reply right away. I leaned on the porch railing and waited. "My son told me he spoke with you earlier. I'm here to resolve this issue civilly, but firmly." I gave her a nod. "I remember. He said this place belongs to you." "To our family," she corrected, stepping closer. Her shoes sank slightly into the soft dirt. "There's been a long-standing dispute over this parcel. You're aware this entire side of the lake falls under the Ridgewood HOA jurisdiction." I didn't answer that either. Letting someone run out their rope was often the fastest way to see how far they were willing to go. She flipped her clipboard open and held it up like a priest holding scripture. My father had intent to purchase this property over 30 years ago. There was a clerical error in the transfer, and unfortunately this cabin ended up under someone else's name. It was supposed to be ours, and frankly, I believe it's time to correct that mistake. I finally raised an eyebrow. "A mistake made 3 decades ago." "These things happen," she said smoothly, as if time worked differently for her. "You can't cling to something that was never truly yours." I nodded slowly, considering her. "And who exactly do you think I am?" She gave a little shrug. "Frankly, it doesn't matter. The HOA has rights here. This structure is non-compliant with code, and there are setback violations. We've already started the process of having it reassigned to our trust. You should begin packing your things. We'll offer you a courtesy window of 72 hours. Behind her, the boy smirked, arms crossed like a lawyer's son watching his first court case. He mouthed something to her, probably thought he was coaching Herbert. I didn't care to hear it. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the dry scent of pine and old cedar. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called out again. "Let me ask you something," I said, stepping off the porch. "Did you ever visit this cabin before today?" She hesitated. "That's not relevant." "It is to me. See, I've been coming here since I was a boy. My grandfather built this place with his own hands after coming back from war. Every log, every nail, every window. And I've watched over it, fixed it up, paid the taxes, kept the water running and the chimney clean. Now you show up with a clipboard and a claim from 30 years ago and think, I'll just hand it over because your name's written in bold print." Her smile faltered, just for a breath, but she recovered. "I'm simply following the legal process. This isn't personal." I studied her, the way her fingers clenched her paperwork just a bit tighter, the flicker in her eyes when I mentioned the taxes, the repairs, the history. She wasn't here for justice. She was here because she believed she could get what she wanted by talking fast and pushing harder than the next person. "Then go ahead," I said. "Call whoever you think you need to. We'll let the law sort it out." That seemed to spark something. She lifted her chin and stepped back toward her car. "I will," she said. "And when the police come, I expect you to be cooperative." I smiled, small and calm. Always am. She didn't have a comeback for that. She got in her car, closed the door harder than she needed to, and reversed with a puff of dust and gravel. The boy flipped me a casual salute from the passenger seat, but there was something in his eyes now. Not fear, just confusion. The kind of look a dog gives when the squirrel doesn't run. I stood there watching them go, then turned back toward the cabin. I figured they'd be back within the hour, this time with uniforms. And I'd be waiting. The call came just before 1:30. I watched her from the porch as she paced beside the Lexus, phone pressed tight to her ear, one hand flailing in practiced frustration. Her voice rose and fell in waves, shrill in the still air. She kept glancing toward the cabin like she was watching a wild animal from a distance, convinced it might charge if she looked away too long. I didn't need to hear the words to know the type of call she was making. The cadence was always the same. Start with urgency. Sprinkle in some fear. Emphasize that you're a woman alone, facing a man who doesn't belong. Mention property. Mention threats. It wasn't truth she was aiming for. It was control. And the phone was her favorite weapon. From where I stood, mug in hand, I could almost recite her script. Yes, officer. I'm at my family's property and a man is refusing to leave. He won't identify himself, and he's acting aggressive. I'm just worried for my son's safety. There it was. That last line always sealed the deal. When a mother claims her child is in danger, the system moves faster. I knew it. I had seen it play out on both sides of the badge. People who knew how to bend fear to their advantage got the fastest service. She ended the call with a smug little smile, phone still in hand as she turned back toward the lake, arms crossed like a sentinel waiting for backup. Her son stood beside her, hands in his pockets, his posture dripping with teenage arrogance. I imagined he thought the cavalry was about to come in, lights blazing, take me down in front of them, maybe even get a little roughed up for good measure. He looked excited. I walked back inside the cabin and rinsed my mug, set it gently in the sink. The light filtered through the window, catching on the old photos tacked above the counter. My grandfather in uniform, smiling in front of the very same cabin. My father as a boy, holding a string of trout. Me, maybe 8 years old, grinning toothless in a flannel shirt, sitting on the steps with a jar of fireflies in my lap. These walls weren't just timber, they were time pressed into place. I sat down in the old rocker by the front window. It creaked under my weight the same way it always had. I reached for the radio on the shelf behind me and turned it to the local frequency. Static at first, then a familiar voice, one of the dispatchers from the next county over. Unit 7, be advised, we've got a 10:29 in progress at Ridgewood Lake. Caller reports a possible squatter, male, refusing to leave. I waited. The line crackled. Copy that. Dispatch, can you clarify the address? Ridgewood Lake, Lot 22. Caller is Deborah Renshaw. Advises suspect is unknown male, possibly dangerous. Claims to have ownership but no proof. I leaned back and let the rocker move, slow and steady. They were sending deputies, likely from the county line. Probably ones who didn't know me, didn't know the cabin, didn't recognize the badge that sat in a drawer by the kitchen door. That was fine. I'd been chief of police in this town for 7 years. Before that, I worked homicide in the city. I'd worn every kind of badge there was, from the blue wool of beat patrol to the dark jackets of investigators. I'd been in courtrooms, interrogation rooms, blood-slick floors and silent morgues, but none of that ever felt as heavy as sitting still and letting people decide who they think you are. Some men get loud when they're disrespected. They throw their title in your face like a fist. I don't do that. I learned a long time ago that the more powerful you are, the quieter you can afford to be. Titles don't need to shout when they're real. A breeze came in through the open window, carrying the smell of wood smoke and lake water. Somewhere, a boat engine started and echoed across the water. The normal hum of life continued, untouched by the storm heading my way. I stood and opened the drawer beside the sink, pulled out the badge, the real one, weighty and worn, the leather backing soft from years of use. I held it for a moment, then set it on the table beside my phone. No need to wear it yet. Let them come. Let her watch them arrive with their flashlights and questions and eager hands twitching toward cuffs. Let her smile that smile, the one that says she thinks the world is finally working the way she believes it should. Because when they stepped foot on this porch, they'd find out who was actually in charge of this town. And it wasn't the woman waving a clipboard. They came in fast, gravel popping under their tires, lights spinning but sirens off. 2 black and white SUVs turned off the ridge road and cut across the clearing like they'd rehearsed it. Both rigs bore the county seal, not my town's, which told me everything I needed to know. Outsiders, deputies called in from across the line. Likely no more than a year or two into the job, maybe itching for their first big arrest. I was standing by the porch rail, arms loose at my sides, watching them with the stillness that unsettles people who are used to suspects panicking. Deborah was already waving them down like she was hailing a cab. Her son stood behind her, arms folded, leaning against their Lexus with the kind of smirk boys wear when they believe they've finally won something that matters. The first deputy out was young, maybe mid-20s, sandy blonde hair, blue eyes sharp with adrenaline. He touched his weapon as he approached, not drawing it, but letting his fingers rest on the holster like a warning. The other followed close behind, shorter, hair buzzed to the scalp, eyes quick and scanning. They'd already taken a stance before a word passed between us. "You the one staying in that cabin?" the blonde one asked, voice tight with authority he hadn't yet earned. "I am." "You have any ID on you?" I looked at him, let the question hang in the air. "What's the nature of your call?" I asked. He stiffened, clearly not used to questions from someone not in cuffs. The woman stepped in before he could answer. "I called," she said, stepping forward. "This man is illegally occupying a property my family has claimed to. He refused to leave when asked, and became confrontational with my son. He's trespassing." The deputies gave each other a glance. The shorter one moved toward the cabin, eyes on the windows, hand near his radio. They were moving fast, too fast, trying to control a situation they didn't understand. "Sir," the blonde deputy said, "we're going to need you to come down from the porch and present ID. We can talk about property claims at the station." I stayed right where I was, hands visible, posture relaxed. I wasn't trying to provoke them. I just wasn't going to perform for them either. "You know what department you're out of?" I asked quietly. "County," he replied. "Why?" "No issue with that. Just curious how far you came to answer this kind of call." The boy laughed behind his mother, muttering something about finally putting him in his place. I didn't acknowledge it. "Sir," the deputy repeated, firmer this time, "step down and show me your identification. If you don't comply, we will detain you for obstruction." I could see it now, the way it would unfold. One false move, one word said too sharp, and they'd be on me with cuffs and knees and force justified later by a misread expression. They didn't know me. To them, I was just a man in a cabin, a problem to be handled. I reached slowly into my back pocket and pulled out my wallet, flipped it open, held up the ID side first. The deputy looked at it, squinting, then stepped closer. His posture shifted. His eyes flicked from the card to my face, then to the badge still sitting on the porch table. "Chief," he said, voice faltering. "Malcolm Hayes, Chief of Police, 3 towns over." The other deputy turned at the sound of the name. He stopped moving, hand frozen just above his belt. The younger one in front of me swallowed hard, then stepped back half a pace. I bent down, picked up the leather case with my badge inside, and held it up for him to see. The gold caught the light. "I'd appreciate it," I said evenly, "if you holstered your assumptions next time." Deborah looked like someone had slapped the breath out of her. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Her son's smirk evaporated. "But he," she started, pointing, flustered. "He didn't say who he was." "You didn't ask," I said, eyes never leaving the deputy's face. He nodded slowly, embarrassed now. "We didn't realize. Dispatch didn't say anything about a name." "They wouldn't. You were fed a story, and you ran with it." I paused, letting it settle. "Don't worry, you're not the first." Behind me, the screen door creaked as it swayed in the breeze. A bird called out from a nearby tree, loud in the silence that followed. The lake shimmered behind us, untouched and quiet, like it had no interest in what we were doing here. The blonde deputy took a step back and cleared his throat. "Apologies, Chief. We'll report that the matter's being handled." "You do that," I said, "and if anyone needs further clarification, they can come speak to me directly." Deborah looked stunned. Her son kicked at the dirt, humiliated and confused. I gave a short nod to the deputies. They returned it with more respect this time, turned to their vehicles, and drove off without another word. I watched them go, then turned back to the woman on the edge of my property. She didn't say anything, not a word, just stood there, small in her silence. I stepped back inside and closed the door behind me, let her figure out the rest on her own. The sound of the patrol cars faded down the ridge road, swallowed by the trees and distance. Inside the cabin it was quiet again, the kind of quiet that settles not just into the walls but into your chest. I poured another cup of coffee and sat down by the window, letting the steam rise into the late afternoon light. Outside, Deborah hadn't moved. She stood near her car, arms stiff at her sides, watching the empty drive like she expected someone else to come roaring back and finish what the deputies couldn't. Her son paced nearby, kicking at rocks, muttering under his breath. He wouldn't look at the cabin anymore. Whatever heat he'd carried in earlier had cooled to smoke. You could see it in the way his shoulders hunched and the way he kept looking at his mother for direction, but she was unraveling and he knew it. I opened the window and leaned into the frame. "Still want to talk?" I asked. She looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten I was still part of this equation. Her face twisted through 3 different expressions before it settled on the one she thought might still work. "I don't understand why you didn't just say who you were." I let the question hang. Then I stepped outside and walked toward her slowly, not to intimidate, just to be clear I wasn't hiding. When I stopped a few feet from her, I could see her eyes scanning my shirt, searching for a uniform, something that made this easier to swallow. "I didn't say because you didn't ask," I said. "You made up your mind before I opened my mouth." She crossed her arms, but the power was gone from it. The stance was all memory now. "I thought you were just another squatter. You weren't listed on the HOA's ownership rolls. This cabin's been in my family for 3 generations. Predates the HOA. Your roles don't apply here." She blinked at that. "That's not what we were told." "By who?" "Our real estate advisor. My father always said this land was ours, that there was a clerical mistake. Funny how mistakes always lean in your favor." She didn't like that. Her jaw clenched and her gaze shifted away. I watched her son edge closer, hovering like he might try to pull her away or jump in to argue again, but he didn't speak. Maybe he knew better this time. I pulled a folded sheet of paper from my back pocket. It was a copy of the original land survey from 1949, the year my grandfather laid the first log by hand. I handed it to her. "You can take that to your advisor. The name on the title has never changed. You were betting I didn't know how to prove it. You were wrong." She held the paper like it might bite her, scanned it quickly, then tucked it under her arm. "I'll have to speak with legal." "You do that." A long silence passed. A car drove by on the far road, somewhere beyond the trees. I heard the distant hum of a boat motor, slow and steady. The cabin behind me felt like a mountain now, unmoved and solid. Deborah looked at it the way a person looks at a locked vault. "I didn't mean for this to get so heated," she said finally. I studied her for a moment. "You brought the heat. You just didn't expect the fire to turn." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the kind of look that belongs to people who've always gotten their way. But there was something else in her face now, a sliver of doubt, or maybe recognition. It's hard to tell with people like her. Sometimes it's not regret. It's just embarrassment that the performance didn't work. I turned to go, but stopped and looked back at her. "You should be more careful," I said. "You called armed deputies on a man sitting on his own porch with a cup of coffee. You're lucky it turned out this way." She bristled. I was scared. I had every right to call for help. Scared of what? That I wouldn't hand over what was mine? Her lips tightened, but she didn't answer. Her son looked between us, then dropped his gaze to the dirt. "You got your 15 minutes, I said. "Now take your clipboard and go." With that, I turned and walked back toward the cabin. I didn't need to look behind me to know they were still standing there. The weight of silence always tells you who's left with the truth and who's still hoping to talk over it. I stepped onto the porch, sat back in the rocker, and sipped my coffee. Behind me, the cabin stood tall, unchanged, just like it always had. She came back the next day like nothing had happened. Different outfit, same attitude. This time she wore a blazer over a pale pink blouse and heels that still didn't belong in dirt. Her son wasn't with her, which was probably for the best. She climbed out of her Lexus with a folder in hand and a pair of oversized sunglasses shielding half her face. The kind of armor people wear when they've decided the truth is just a detail to be corrected. I was sitting on the porch steps, sharpening an old hatchet against a whetstone. The rhythm of it was slow and steady, something that kept my hands busy while my mind stayed clear. She didn't bother greeting me. "I've brought documentation," she said, holding up the folder like a warrant. "You'll want to see this." I didn't reach for it. I nodded to the railing beside her. "You can set it there. I'll take a look when I'm done." She hesitated, lips pressed tight, then placed the folder on the wood and crossed her arms. You may think you've scared us off, but this isn't finished. I spoke to our attorney. He's reviewing the HOA charter, and we believe we've got a legitimate case. I turned the hatchet in my hand and resumed the slow scrape along the stone. I don't answer to the HOA. She laughed softly, but it didn't sound natural. Technically, every resident in Ridgewood is subject to the homeowner's rules, and your grandfather never filed an exemption when the board was formed. That means this property is under our jurisdiction. You just told me yesterday the cabin doesn't legally belong to me. Now it does, but it breaks your rules. She didn't blink, just tilted her chin up and kept going. You have no permit for that woodpile. You've got an unregistered dock, and I checked this structure's chimney hasn't been certified in over 5 years. All of those are violations. I looked up at her then. You really came out here to tell me my chimney needs a certificate? Her smile tightened, sharp as a paper cut. I came here to warn you. There's still time to avoid a full legal process. If you sell the property to us directly, quietly, we can keep this from becoming more complicated. I'm offering a peaceful solution. I stood slowly and set the hatchet down, walked over to the folder and opened it. 6 pages of regulations, maps with red ink, highlighted clauses from a community charter that didn't apply to anything on this side of the lake. I flipped through them, then closed it. Did your lawyer write these notes? My son helped. He's pre-law, very bright. I nodded, then handed the folder back to her. Tell your son he skipped the part where this land falls outside Ridgewood's annex boundary. It never joined the HOA, never signed the charter, and your paperwork means nothing here. She took the folder like it had turned into a stone in her hands. Are you threatening me? No, but I'll tell you this. If you keep harassing me, you'll be dealing with it in court, civil and criminal. Her face flushed, not just red but something deeper, a twisting frustration of someone who's always gotten their way and suddenly feels the walls pressing in. She glanced toward the lake, like it might give her an answer. The water didn't offer anything. You have no idea how powerful I am in this town, she said. I know exactly how loud you are, I replied. That's not the same thing. She stepped back toward her car, folder tucked tight under her arm like it might still be useful. But before she opened the door, she turned around again. We'll see what the rest of the HOA has to say. I'm not the only one tired of this eyesore of a shack lowering our property values. I looked past her at the trees, swaying behind the road, tall and steady. This shack has stood here longer than Ridgewood has had a name, and it'll still be standing when you're done yelling. She got in the car and slammed the door. It shook dust from the roof. She didn't drive off right away, just sat there, staring through the windshield, hands on the wheel, breathing through her teeth. I went back to the steps, picked up the hatchet, and pressed it to the stone again. Eventually, the Lexus backed out and disappeared down the road. Behind me, the cabin stood like it always had, quiet, strong, unbothered. I didn't do much that afternoon. The firewood was already stacked, the tools put away, and the lake had gone still as glass again. There was nothing to fix, nothing to chase. Just the wind moving slow through the trees and the smell of pine sap in the air. I sat out on the porch as the sun dipped low, holding a faded photograph in one hand and a tin cup of coffee in the other. The photo was curled at the edges and soft from years of hands touching it. My grandfather stood in front of the cabin, hammer in one hand, a cigarette tucked behind his ear. He wore overalls and a grin that stretched wide across his face. The beams behind him were still raw, not yet stained by weather or time. You could see the frame of the dock in the background, just starting to take shape. That dock has been rebuilt 3 times since, and it still leans a little left. I was 5 years old the first time he brought me here. My dad had taken off by then, disappeared somewhere out west, so my grandfather filled the space without saying much. He wasn't a talker, not unless you asked him about something worth knowing, but he believed in hands. If you could fix a roof, start a fire from nothing, gut a fish, or keep a promise, then you were already halfway to being the kind of man the world needed more of. We slept in sleeping bags on the floor that first night. The walls were bare, just insulation between rough-hewn boards. No water, no lights. Just oil lamps, firewood, and a stubborn old man who said the trees would teach me more than school ever could. He wasn't wrong. He built this place one board at a time, dragging every piece in from the road himself, because he didn't want anyone else telling him how it should look. Some folks in town offered to help. He told them no. Not out of pride, but because he wanted this place to be his, and ours, and no one else's. Over the years, the cabin became the only steady thing in a life that didn't always go the way I'd planned. I came here when I left the army. I came here when I lost my first partner in the line of duty. I came here when I got tired of hearing sirens in my sleep and needed a place to remember what quiet sounded like. I've patched the roof, rewired the lights, replaced the steps more times than I can count, and I've done it without changing what mattered. The wood's still rough under your fingers. The windows still stick if the air's damp. The floorboards creak in the same places they always have. It's not polished, but it's honest. Every mark in the wood tells a story. That's what Karen doesn't understand. To her, the cabin is just a piece of land, a number on a map, something to acquire and fold into a portfolio. She sees an old structure and thinks it needs to be cleaned up or torn down. She sees the lake and wants to post signs, but this place wasn't meant to be conquered. It was meant to be lived in. You don't tame the lake. You learn to respect it. When I was 16, I caught a smallmouth bass just off the dock, nearly 2 feet long. My grandfather helped me hold it up for a photo, then released it back into the water. I asked him why we didn't keep it. Some things, he said, ain't meant to be taken, just remembered. I never forgot that. I walked down to the dock as the sun slipped behind the trees. The water glowed orange and gold. I sat on the edge, letting my boots dangle, watching the ripples stretch out and fade. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called. Same as always. I keep the deed in a lockbox inside the cabin, along with my grandfather's medals and the pocket knife he carried through the war. The deed is stamped and signed, notarized long before Deborah Renshaw ever moved into her neighborhood. There's no dispute, no confusion. Just truth printed in black ink, tied to a man who earned this land not by asking but by building. People like her don't understand roots because they're always looking for ways to pull things up. They think history only counts if it's written on glossy paper, if it's approved by a board or backed by a committee. But real history lives in calloused hands and quiet mornings. It lives in the smell of cedar, in the sound of a screen door creaking open, in the memory of a man who never raised his voice but made the world listen anyway. I came back up from the dock just as the stars were coming out, lit the lamp, set the photo back on the shelf, and sat in the rocker by the window. The cabin groaned a little, settling on its foundation like it always does at night, and I smiled to myself. This place wasn't just where I came to rest. It was where I remembered who I am. It was Deputy Marklin who first brought it up. We were standing outside the precinct 2 days after the incident, sharing a quiet smoke beneath the flagpole while the morning shift got underway. He leaned against the side of his cruiser, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the distant ridge like he could see through trees and time. "You know," he said, tapping ash from the end of his cigarette, "that woman causing trouble out by your cabin? She's been flagged before. Not criminally, but there's notes." I looked over, one eyebrow raised. "What kind of notes?" He shrugged, slow and thoughtful. "Nuisance complaints, petty harassment, even a false report or two, but always just far enough under the bar to avoid charges. The kind of paper trail that piles up quietly until someone finally digs through it." I didn't say anything at first. I just watched the sunrise catch on the roof of the station, gold streaks crawling over chipped shingles and bird droppings. Every small town has a few names that get passed around quietly, the kind of people officers groan about when they see the address come over dispatch. "What else?" I asked. Marklin glanced around, then pulled out his phone. "I shouldn't be showing you this, technically, but it's not restricted. Public complaints." He swiped to a file and passed it to me. I read through them slow. A pattern emerged within 3 lines. March 2022. Called to report neighbors' wind chimes as a public disturbance. July 2022. Claimed a child on a bicycle was casing her house. October 2022. Demanded HOA fine a homeowner for leaving their porch light on past 10. It went on like that. Dozens of reports over a 3-year span, each one petty on its own. But together, they formed something else entirely. A portrait of someone who used systems the way others use weapons. "She plays the game," Marklin said, taking the phone back. Knows exactly how to dance just outside consequence. And her son? I asked. His face changed at that. Now that's another story, he said. Couple months back, there was an incident at the high school. Some vandalism, a teacher's tires slashed, hateful message spray-painted on the wall. Never caught who did it, but his name came up in the rumors. I nodded, slow. It fit too well. That boy had walked onto my porch like he'd inherited the place, not just the land, but the world. Like he believed there would be no consequence, only applause. You don't get that kind of confidence by accident. Someone has to teach it, or model it. You want me to keep digging? Marklin asked, quiet. No need, I said. She's already unraveling. I'd rather let her show the town who she is. And she did, faster than I expected. The next day, a neighbor from the far side of the lake called in. He wanted to speak privately. Retired, lived quiet, didn't bother anyone. When I arrived, he handed me a manila envelope without saying a word. Inside were copies of emails, dozens of them, all from Deborah. HOA correspondence mostly, but written in a tone that barely masked her contempt. She called people lazy, uneducated, unfit to live in Ridgewood, demanded votes be held in secret, threatened to have elderly neighbors removed for aesthetic violations. One thread in particular caught my eye. It was about a couple that had just moved in, a black family with 2 kids and a dog that barked on occasion. Deborah had called them a mistake and insisted their presence would lower values. This ain't someone who just loves rules, the neighbor said. She loves control, loves being the one who decides who belongs and who doesn't. Folks been scared to say anything because she's loud and she never lets go. I left with the folder and a sense that what I'd seen out at the cabin was only the latest chapter in a long story. Deborah didn't care about property. Not really. What she hated was not being in charge, not being able to bend someone into moving. She had spent years tightening her grip on the HOA, and this cabin was one of the last things in the area she couldn't touch. That night I sat on the porch and watched the sun go down. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel surprised. I just felt tired. Not from the fight, but from the familiarity of it. People like her never change, but sometimes they get seen for what they are. And once that happens, they don't get to play the hero anymore. By the end of the week, Ridgewood wasn't humming with whispers, it was shouting. Word travels fast in small towns, but in neighborhoods like Ridgewood, it spreads like wildfire wrapped in perfume. Polite on the surface, destructive underneath. It started with a forwarded email sent by a former board member who had grown tired of being silenced. That email made its way to a local reporter who ran a small newsletter called the Pine Watch Weekly, mostly used to post lost pet notices and advertise bake sales. But when that headline dropped, HOA president accused of misuse of funds and abuse of power, people paid attention. I sat at the diner in town, nursing my usual black coffee, while whispers rose from every booth. I didn't need to eavesdrop. Folks didn't lower their voices when they talked about Deborah Renshaw anymore. They didn't even look over their shoulders. They say she was using HOA dues to landscape her private garden, someone said, and had the board sign off on it by calling it shared green space, another added. That woman fined me for leaving my canoe at the shoreline, but she threw a private party on the dock last summer, with lights and a band. She sent a warning letter because my fence was 2 inches too tall. 2 inches, who does that? I kept my face neutral. I wasn't interested in celebrating, but there was a certain satisfaction in watching the weight shift. Deborah had built her rule on silence, on people not wanting to cause trouble. But trouble, it turned out, had found her. The newsletter article had receipts, screenshots of budget approvals that didn't match meeting records, handwritten notes from neighbors who had been threatened with fines or eviction, an audio recording of her berating a younger board member for hesitating to vote her way. It was all there, layer after layer of control hidden behind the language of order. By the second day, HOA members were meeting without her. They gathered in the back room of the town library, a dozen residents, many of whom had stayed quiet for years. They invited a city mediator to observe and help them understand their rights. Deborah showed up to that meeting too, of course. She walked in like she still owned the floor, clutching a leather planner and wearing a silk scarf the color of rust. But the room didn't rise for her. Nobody smiled. Nobody motioned for her to take the front chair. "You're not authorized to hold a meeting without the president's approval," she said. "We're not asking for approval," a soft-spoken man replied. His name was Carter Blake. He'd lived in Ridgewood for 20 years, kept to himself, raised a daughter who now taught 4th grade at the local school. Deborah had once fined him $500 for repainting his mailbox without submitting a color sample. He had never raised his voice before, but that night, he did not waver. Deborah tried to take control, rattling off procedures and citing bylaws, but someone had come prepared. A woman in the back held up a thick packet of documents, HOA rules, meeting transcripts and state code. She read aloud from a clause that allowed a special vote when leadership misconduct was suspected. The room voted that night, 11-1. By the next morning, her title was suspended pending a full review. I heard about it from the clerk at the gas station. She handed me my receipt and leaned in like she was passing a secret. "They voted her out," she whispered. She stormed out crying, got in her Lexus and nearly clipped the curb. I nodded, thanked her, and stepped outside into the early fall breeze. It smelled like wood smoke and rain. Across the lot, an older couple stood by their truck, smiling softly at me. I gave them a small wave. The tide had turned, not with anger, but with exhaustion. People were tired of being pushed, tired of shrinking to keep peace. They saw now that Deborah's peace wasn't peace at all. It was silence enforced with rules no one had agreed to. Back at the cabin, I took out the envelope of printed emails the neighbor had given me and tossed it into the fire. I had no use for it now. The town had handled it. Not with fists or force, but by standing up. That was enough. The phone rang that night. It was Carter. "Just wanted to thank you," he said. "Not for anything you did, but for not moving when she tried to push you." "You did the hard part," I said. "We all did." Finally. When I hung up, I stepped out to the porch. The moon hung over the lake like a quiet witness. The cabin creaked softly, the way it always did when night fell. I didn't need to say anything. The stillness said it all. It started with a knock on the cabin door. Not the sharp, impatient kind I'd gotten used to in the last week, but a gentle tap, more curious than demanding. I set my coffee down and opened the door to find a man standing there in a flannel shirt, ball cap in hand, eyes downcast like he wasn't sure if he should be there at all. "You don't know me," he said, "but I live down on Willow Bend, 3 lots over from the Ridgewood sign." I nodded. "I know the place. Blue shutters, canoe rack in the yard." His face lit up with a bit of surprise, and he chuckled. "That's us. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, for not saying anything sooner, for not speaking up when she started going after you." I stepped out and leaned on the porch rail beside him. The wind was light, just enough to stir the trees. He kept his eyes on the lake. "She fined us last year for painting our shed. Said the color violated community standards. Only color we had was what we could afford. I wanted to fight it, but my wife was worried. Didn't want to draw attention. We paid it. $75. Felt like paying tribute to a queen." "She's not queen anymore," I said. "No," he smiled, "but she sure acted like one." He turned to go, then paused. "We're glad you stood your ground. It gave us a little courage, too." That was the first. Then came more. A retired schoolteacher brought a peach pie and sat for a spell. Said Deborah once tried to report her for inconsistent mailbox aesthetics. A mother of 3 stopped by on her evening walk, thanked me for making her feel like the lake was hers again. Even the high school janitor left a note tucked into the screen door, scribbled in pencil saying only, "Some of us see what matters. Glad you stayed." The town hadn't changed overnight, but the hush had broken. People who used to glance down when her name came up now looked each other in the eye. It was subtle, but real. A kind of collective breath they hadn't taken in years. I walked into the diner a few days later, and the whole room didn't stop the way it used to when I entered in uniform. Instead, heads nodded. A few folks stood to shake my hand. Mrs. Blanchard from the hardware store pressed a paper bag into my chest without saying anything. Inside was a jar of her homemade preserves and a note that read, "Some things are worth keeping just the way they are." At the register, the waitress wouldn't take my money. "It's on us," she said. "1 cup of coffee can't repay what you gave this town." I didn't argue, just smiled, tipped extra, and stepped out into the golden light of late afternoon. The leaves had started to change. The maples along the ridge wore the first hints of red and gold. The lake shimmered like glass. Back at the cabin, I found two kids skipping rocks near the dock. They froze when they saw me, half expecting to get chased off. I walked down slow, hands in my pockets. "Afternoon," I said. "You boys staying out of trouble?" One of them nodded, eyes wide. "My dad said you're the chief." "I am." "The one who made the HOA lady go away?" I grinned. "Not quite. She made herself go away. I just didn't let her take something that didn't belong to her." The boys shared a look, then went back to skipping rocks. As I turned to head inside, one of them called out, "My dad said to tell you thanks for not backing down." I raised a hand in reply and walked up the hill. Inside the cabin, the air was warm with the scent of pine and old wood. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, listening. There was no noise, no knocking, no voices demanding titles or property. Just the deep, familiar silence of a place that had outlived bluster. Not every battle makes a sound when it ends. Some just fade, like mist off the water, slow and quiet. But when the town finds its voice again, you hear it in every thank you, every nod, every hand extended not out of obligation, but out of respect. This place would always be home, but now, for the first time in a long while, it felt like the people around it remembered why. It was just past midnight when I heard the crunch of gravel. No lights, no engine rumble, just footsteps, slow, hesitant. I sat in the rocker by the window, the lamp low, letting the cabin's quiet do what it always did, tell the truth without a single word. I didn't reach for a weapon, didn't even stand. I already knew who it was. The front steps creaked. A figure moved past the porch rail, pausing in the dark like he wasn't sure whether to knock or run. I leaned forward and flicked the lamp a bit brighter. "You're late," I said through the screen door. The boy jumped. Same one from that first day, Deborah's son. His hoodie was pulled up, and he carried something under his arm, a crowbar. It dropped to the porch with a soft clatter when he realized I was awake. He looked thinner than I remembered, smaller too, like the weight of everything had finally settled on his shoulders. "I wasn't gonna do anything," he mumbled. "You brought a crowbar." He kicked it gently with the toe of his sneaker. "I don't know why I brought it." I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The night was cold and still. No wind, no frogs, just stars above and the lake stretched out below like a black mirror. "Want to tell me why you're here?" He didn't answer right away, just sat down on the top step, elbows on his knees, staring out into the dark. "She cried all day," he said. "After they voted her out, after that article, she didn't eat. She just kept saying she'd been betrayed, that everyone was jealous of her, that you made her look like a fool." I sat beside him, leaving space. "She blamed me too," he said. "Said I escalated things. Said I made her look weak." "You didn't make her anything," I said. He nodded slowly. "I believed her, you know, about the cabin. She always said it was supposed to be ours, that we were owed it, that people like us were always overlooked and this was our chance to get something back." "And what do you believe now?" He looked at me, eyes red-rimmed but dry. "I think we took what wasn't ours, and I think we did it because we thought no one would stop us." The moon slipped from behind a cloud, lighting the trees in silver. The crowbar glinted at his feet. "I don't want to be like her," he whispered. "I'm scared I already am." I let that sit for a while. The hardest truths are the ones people whisper to themselves when they think no one is listening. "You still in school?" I asked. He nodded. "Barely. I was suspended last spring. My grades are garbage. Nobody talks to me anymore." "You looking for a clean slate?" He looked over, hesitant. "Would that even be possible?" "I don't know," I said. "But you won't get one breaking into cabins with a crowbar." He gave a half laugh, half sigh. "Yeah, I figured that out halfway here." We sat in silence for a bit longer. The air smelled of pine and cold water. "You ever chop wood?" I asked. He blinked. "What?" "Wood. You ever split it?" "No." "You hungry?" He nodded. I stood. "Come inside. I'll make you something. In the morning, you're going to help me stack the firewood you would have tried to destroy." He stood too, still unsure if this was a trick. "And after that?" he asked. "We'll figure it out." He followed me into the cabin, quiet as a shadow. I made him eggs and toast. He ate like he hadn't had a meal in a while. Afterward, he took the blanket I offered and curled up on the old sofa by the fireplace. Before I turned off the light, he spoke again. "You think she ever cared about the cabin itself?" "No," I said. "She cared about what it meant to win." The fire cracked softly. He turned his face to the wall. "I never really had a father," he said. "Neither did I." And with that, the silence returned. Not heavy, not strained, just quiet, healing, the kind that only lives in places built by hands, not papers. Where a boy with nothing to prove can sit still for the first time and not be judged for how he got there. By morning, the boy was already on the porch, sitting with his hands folded in his lap like he wasn't sure if he was waiting for punishment or direction. The sun had barely cleared the ridge, and the lake glowed with the soft colors of a new day. I stepped out with 2 mugs, handed him one, and sat beside him. He thanked me without looking up. We didn't say much. The quiet between us wasn't awkward now. It felt like something earned. When the last sips were gone and the warmth faded from the cups, I set mine aside and stood. Time to get to work. He followed me without question. We hauled logs from the pile out back, stacked them along the side of the cabin, filled the wood rack near the fireplace. He was clumsy at first, dropped a few, scraped his knuckles once, but he didn't complain. Sweat beaded along his brow, and by noon his hoodie was tied around his waist. I didn't offer praise or correction, just let the labor speak. When we finished, he leaned against the porch post and wiped his hands on his jeans. "You always do this alone?" "Usually." He nodded, then looked toward the lake. "I figured you'd call someone, press charges, teach me a lesson." I picked up a small bundle of kindling and walked it to the bin. "I am teaching you a lesson, just not the one you expected." He blinked, uncertain. "I've seen where a record leads," I said. "One moment of stupid becomes a label that follows you into every room, makes people decide who you are before you open your mouth." He looked away, jaw tight. "I don't want to be that person," he said, "but I feel like I'm already halfway there." "You're here, aren't you?" He didn't answer, but the way he nodded said enough. Later, I made lunch. We ate in silence, grilled cheese and leftover stew. Afterward, I pulled a manila envelope from the drawer. Inside were pamphlets from the local youth court, a few printed emails from a mentorship program I helped set up through the department, and a handwritten note from a friend who worked with first-time offenders. I slid it across the table. "You're going to take this. You're going to meet with Officer Diaz at the community center on Tuesday. Tell her everything. She'll set you up with the program." His fingers hovered over the envelope. "And if I don't? Then you're wasting both our time." He picked it up slowly, opened the flap, and scanned the contents. His shoulders fell as he read. "I thought justice was about consequences," he said. "It is, but not every consequence needs a cage." He looked up at me, eyes glassy. "Why are you helping me?" I didn't answer right away. I stood and cleared the table, rinsing the dishes and setting them on the drying rack. The sound of water filled the space. "Because someone helped me once," I said finally, "when I was about your age, angry at the world and ready to set fire to everything I touched. A cop caught me shoplifting a radio. I thought I was finished." "What happened?" "He gave me a choice, charges or a second chance. I worked in his garage for 6 months, learned tools, responsibility, how to keep promises." He leaned forward. "Did you ever tell him thank you?" I dried my hands and turned to him. I named my son after him. The boy didn't say anything after that, just folded the envelope and tucked it into his backpack. When he left, he didn't look back, but I knew he'd be back. Not with a crowbar, but with a better version of himself. Sometimes you don't need a courtroom. You just need someone to sit with you in the dark and not turn on the light until you're ready to see. Later that evening, I stood at the edge of the dock and watched the sky catch fire with sunset. The cabin behind me was still. My grandfather used to say justice wasn't about balancing scales. It was about putting things right. Not perfect, not fixed, just right. And for the first time in days, I felt like something had shifted in the right direction. Not because I'd won anything, but because the boy had made it through the night and found a reason to try again. That was enough. I got the letter on a Thursday. Certified envelope, legal header, signature required. Deborah Renshaw wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. She was suing me for harassment, unlawful occupation, and defamation of character. The language was stiff, the tone smug, the demands ridiculous. She wanted financial damages, a public apology, and full control of the property, all wrapped in legal terms that barely held together. I read it twice, then set it on the table beside my coffee and didn't touch it again. The next morning I called my attorney, an old friend named Grant who had spent most of his career reading through junk like this. He skimmed the document while sipping from a thermos and chuckling every third line. She really thinks she can win this? She thinks if she throws enough paper at the wall, something might stick. Grant shook his head. There's no leg to stand on. She's making noise. That's all this is. You want to respond formally? No. Let her have her day. He looked up. You sure? I nodded. Sometimes the best way to handle a tantrum is to let it play out in front of a crowd. And so we did. She filed her complaint with the county civil court, requested an expedited hearing, and came dressed in tailored beige and pearl earrings when the day arrived. I wore my uniform. Not out of pride, but because I was on duty. It wasn't for show. It was simply the truth. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, the kind of place where the judge knew the bailiff's kids by name. Deborah sat with her attorney, stiff-backed and rehearsed. She had pages of notes, highlighted quotes, printed photos of the cabin taken from angles meant to make it look dilapidated and dangerous. She whispered sharply to her lawyer between motions. She was ready for war. What she wasn't ready for was the judge. Robert Lawson had been on the bench for over 2 decades. He wasn't one for drama or grand speeches. He liked facts. He liked calm. And he liked his weekends quiet, preferably with a fishing pole in hand. We'd never shared more than a few pleasantries over the years, but I knew enough to trust his sense. He read through her filings, glanced at my brief response, and looked up slowly. Mrs. Renshaw, he said, voice even. I'd like to begin by clarifying something. Are you, at this moment, claiming that the defendant is illegally occupying a property that does not belong to him? Yes, Your Honor. He nodded. And are you aware that the defendant is the current, seated police chief of the neighboring town, and that the property in question has been in his family for over 70 years? She hesitated. I was not aware of all those details when I first raised concern, but I believe there are procedural. He held up a hand. That will be enough. Her lawyer tried to speak. The judge waved him quiet. I've reviewed the documents. The deed is clear. The property line is clear. The HOA has no jurisdiction over the parcel. And your attempts to intimidate or displace the current occupant fall dangerously close to harassment. She opened her mouth, closed it. The judge leaned back. You are entitled to file complaints, Mrs. Renshaw, but you are not entitled to waste the court's time with grievances dressed in the language of justice. This case is dismissed. The gavel fell, sharp and final. She stood there, stunned, as the room emptied around her. Her lawyer packed up in silence. No eye contact, no last words, just a quiet retreat. I didn't look back as I left. Later that evening I heard the news. She'd put her house on the market. Word was, the HOA had called for a full audit of her time in leadership. There were whispers of funds unaccounted for, documents missing. She was no longer welcome at community events, no longer invited to speak at meetings. She had become what she feared most irrelevant. I sat on the porch that night, watching the moon rise over the lake, the last of the summer warmth slipping away with the breeze. The cabin behind me stood as it always had, untouched and quiet. And for the first time in a long while, the road beyond the trees stayed empty. No more Lexus. No more shouting. Just the sound of water lapping the shore, and a town finally breathing easy. September folded into October without a single knock on my door. No more surprise visits, no more threats disguised as favors. The lake settled into its old rhythm, smooth and slow, the way it used to be before anyone tried to claim it with fences or rules. The trees had begun their quiet transformation. Gold and rust-colored leaves drifted across the porch each morning, landing gently as if they knew this was a place that asked nothing of them. I spent most of my time outside. There was always something to tend. A loose board on the dock, a shutter that needed repainting, the old chimney that puffed a little too much smoke on cold mornings. It was work, but not the kind that wears a man down. It filled the day without emptying the soul. When I finished, I'd sit on the steps with a mug of coffee and watch the water shift with the wind. The boy didn't come back for a while, but I wasn't worried. I knew the kind of change he needed didn't happen overnight. It starts slow, like thaw in spring, just enough to loosen the ground beneath you. The last time I saw him, he'd said very little, but his eyes had softened. He was listening now, and that was more than most ever get to. One morning, I found a folded note tucked under a small rock on the porch rail. The handwriting was messy but determined. It read, "Finished my first session. They said I asked good questions. I didn't tell them everything yet, but I will. Thanks for the firewood job. I stacked it better this time. No name. Just that." I smiled and left it there, tucked between the pages of a book I keep by the window. In town, people stopped crossing the street when I passed. They didn't rush to fill the space with talk either. They just nodded, tipped their hats, sometimes offered a few words and moved on. It was respect without noise. I liked it that way. At the grocery store, Carter Blake handed me a bag of red apples from his orchard. He said they were too sweet for pie but good for eating. I said I'd take his word for it and promised to leave a few out for the deer near the tree line. He smiled like he knew that was more honest than saying I'd bake. The cabin creaked in the mornings, groaned a little in the afternoons, same as it always had. I kept a fire going most days, even when it wasn't cold enough to need it. There's something about the way the flames move, the smell of smoke in old stone, that makes a man remember where he came from. I thought about my grandfather more these days. The way he'd sit on the porch with a fishing pole and hum tunes he never named. The way his hands looked when they rested, rough but steady. He didn't leave a lot of words behind, but he left this place, and that's more than enough. I've lived long enough to know there are two kinds of people in this world. The ones who chase titles, and the ones who protect something worth keeping. Deborah had been the first kind. Loud, certain, always climbing. I don't know where she ended up after she left Ridgewood, but I imagine she's somewhere that still lets her feel important. Somewhere with meetings and rules and people who haven't figured her out yet. That's not bitterness talking, just truth. Some folks move on because they want peace. Others because they can't stand to live in a place where no one listens anymore. The lake didn't care. It had seen more seasons than any of us. It would outlast all our names, all our small claims and loud demands. I stood at the end of the dock one evening, watching the last of the sun melt into the horizon. A single loon floated in the center of the water, silent and still. I took off my boots, rolled up my pant legs, and sat on the edge. The water was cold, clean, familiar. I closed my eyes and breathed in deep. It was quiet now. Not just the absence of noise, but a fullness. A space reclaimed. A truth restored. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was holding the line anymore. I was just home. The knock this time was light, polite, not the kind that came with trouble or papers or someone trying to take something. I was inside slicing apples for a small pie, a habit I'd picked up again since Carter kept dropping them off by the sack. The fire was going. The windows cracked just enough to let in the smell of October. When I opened the door, I saw him. He stood a few feet back from the porch, hands in the pockets of a clean hoodie. Not new, but cared for. His shoes were muddy, his jeans a little too short at the ankles, but his eyes were steady now. Not challenging, just honest. "I brought something," he said, lifting a bundle wrapped in a brown towel. I stepped aside and let him through. He walked in like he remembered how, glancing at the old photos on the shelf, at the same rocker he'd sat beside weeks ago. He unwrapped the towel slowly and revealed a small wooden carving. It was rough, the lines uneven, but I knew what it was meant to be. A loon, wings tucked, gliding across a block of polished driftwood. "I made it at the center," he said. "They let us try different things. Said we should make something that reminded us of a safe place." I took it in my hands, felt the weight of it. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The kind of work someone puts themselves into, even when their hands are still learning how to shape the world. "It's yours," he said. "You can keep it on the shelf if you want." "I will," I said, right next to my grandfather's pocket knife. His face changed at that, like the words meant more than he expected them to. He nodded once, then looked down at the floor. They said I can finish the program early, if I keep showing up, if I stay out of trouble. You plan to? He looked up. Yeah, I do. I moved back to the counter and finished the apples while he pulled up a stool. He watched, hands clasped, eyes following the knife, but not out of caution, out of curiosity. When I slid the pie into the small oven, I poured us both something warm, and we sat by the fire. He didn't speak for a while. Neither did I. Some silences aren't meant to be broken. After a while, he asked if he could help with anything else. I led him out to the woodshed, handed him the splitting maul, and pointed to a few thick rounds stacked beside the stump. He went at them without fuss. Clean swings, focused. When he missed, he reset and tried again. I didn't hover, just watched from the porch, letting him learn the way I did. From the feel of the wood, from the work. Later, as the light faded, we stacked the split logs and covered them with the old canvas tarp. He wiped his hands on his jeans and looked out at the water. I didn't get it at first, he said, why this place mattered so much to you. And now? I think it's because it doesn't ask anything from you. It just lets you be. I nodded. Most people don't notice that until they've lost something. He was quiet for a moment. She left, he said. My mom. Took a job in another county. Some HOA consulting thing. Didn't ask if I wanted to go. Did you? No, I told her I was staying. She didn't fight it. That admission hung in the air a moment. Not bitter, not sad, just real. You got anyone looking out for you? I asked. He shrugged. Maybe now I do. We stood there in the growing dusk, not needing more than that. The lake shimmered under the first stars. A loon called once across the water. Before he left, I gave him an old flannel jacket. My grandfather's. A little frayed at the cuffs, soft from time but still warm. He held it like it was more than just fabric. You earned it, I said. He smiled, just barely, then nodded and made his way down the path, his figure getting smaller under the trees. I stepped back inside, set the carving on the shelf, and sat in the old rocker. The fire crackled low, pie cooling on the table, the cabin wrapped in the kind of stillness that only comes when everything lands where it belongs. The lake, the cabin, the boy. Full circle.